What would you do if someone you loved was dying? Picture the small town of Bethany, not far from Jerusalem. The sun beats down on the dusty streets, and the air is thick with sadness. Word is spreading. Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, is gravely ill. His condition has worsened, and there is nothing anyone can do. The sisters, heartbroken and desperate, know there is one person who can help: Jesus. They've seen what he can do, heard of his miracles. They believe he can heal Lazarus if he comes in time. So they send word to him: "Lord, the one you love is sick." But something surprising happens. Jesus, upon hearing the news, does not rush to Bethany. He doesn't immediately set out to save his friend. He stays where he is for 2 more days. It seems strange, doesn't it? Why would he wait when time is running out, when Lazarus is so close to death? Let's stop for a moment and think about this. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you desperately needed God to act, but it felt like he wasn't responding? Maybe you prayed for healing, for a loved one's life, for a situation to change, and it felt like God was silent. Mary and Martha were living that very moment. They had faith, they had hope, and yet Jesus was not coming when they expected him. After 2 days, Jesus finally speaks to his disciples: "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." At first glance, his words are shocking. Jesus is glad? How could he be glad that his dear friend has died? But Jesus knows something that no one else does. He knows this story isn't ending with death. He knows that through this delay, something greater is about to be revealed. His purpose is not just to heal, but to show his disciples, and all of us, something far more powerful. When Jesus and his disciples arrive in Bethany, it's too late, or so it seems. Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. In the ancient Jewish tradition, 4 days meant that death was final. There was a belief that the soul hovered around the body for 3 days. But after that, decay set in and all hope was gone. Lazarus was not just dead, he was really dead. The mourning was deep and the sorrow heavy. Mary and Martha had already buried their brother, and the community had gathered to grieve with them. Martha, always the active one, hears that Jesus is on his way and rushes to meet him. Her words are filled with both faith and heartbreak. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Can you hear the pain in her voice? She believed in Jesus. She knew what he could do. But now it felt like all was lost. And yet, even in her grief, she holds on to a flicker of hope. "But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus looks at her, full of compassion and understanding, and tells her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha, still thinking of the distant future, replies, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." She's thinking of the promise of eternal life, the hope that the dead will one day be raised in the final resurrection. But Jesus is about to shift her understanding in a way she couldn't have imagined. He looks into her eyes and says, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die." Do you believe this? This is more than just a promise of life after death. Jesus is declaring that he is life. In him, death has no ultimate power. Life is not just something he gives, it is who he is. Martha, standing there in her grief, must have struggled to grasp the full meaning of his words. But she answers with faith, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." In this moment, her faith is not in the outcome, not in what Jesus might do, but in who he is. And that's a powerful lesson for us. Sometimes faith doesn't mean understanding everything or seeing the results we want. It means trusting in who Jesus is, even when we don't understand. Martha returns home to get Mary. When Mary hears that Jesus has arrived, she runs to him. Unlike Martha, who had a conversation with Jesus, Mary falls at his feet weeping. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." The weight of her sorrow is overwhelming. She doesn't have words for a theological discussion. She has only tears and grief. And what does Jesus do? He weeps. The Son of God, who knows he is about to raise Lazarus from the dead, cries. He is deeply moved by the sorrow of those he loves. He does not stand apart from their grief. He enters into it. This is such a powerful picture of who God is. He is not distant from our pain. He is not unmoved by our suffering. Even when he knows the miracle that is coming, he is with us in our tears. Jesus weeps because he loves. After a moment, Jesus, still deeply moved, asks to be taken to Lazarus' tomb. The people lead him to a cave with a stone rolled across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he says. But Martha, ever practical, hesitates. "But Lord, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Her faith, which had been so strong moments ago, wavers now. Can you blame her? After all, her brother has been dead for 4 days. The decay has already set in. This is the point of no return. But Jesus gently reminds her, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" Martha and everyone else there is about to witness something beyond their wildest imagination. The stone is rolled away, and Jesus stands before the open tomb. He looks up and prays, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." And then, with a voice full of authority and power, Jesus calls out, "Lazarus, come out." The crowd holds its breath. Can it be? Can this man, dead for 4 days, really come back to life? And then, from the darkness of the tomb, a figure emerges. Lazarus, still wrapped in his grave clothes, stumbles out alive. The crowd gasps. Death has been defeated. The impossible has happened. Lazarus, once dead, is now alive because Jesus has power even over death. Jesus turns to the crowd and says, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Lazarus is not just alive, he is free. Can you imagine the scene? The shock, the awe, the joy? Many who were there that day believed in Jesus. How could they not? They had seen the impossible. They had witnessed the glory of God revealed through the power of Jesus. And now I ask you, do you believe in that same power? The power that can bring dead things in your life back to life. The power that can turn grief into joy, sorrow into hope. If you believe in his power, if you trust in the one who is the resurrection and the life, I encourage you to declare it today. Comment below, "I believe in your power, Lord." This miracle is not just a story of something that happened long ago. It is a picture of who Jesus is today. He is the resurrection and the life. He is the one who weeps with us in our sorrow and the one who calls us out of our tombs. In him, death has no power and life is eternal. Will you trust him? As the crowd stands in shock, watching Lazarus stumble out of the tomb, the weight of what just happened slowly begins to sink in. This wasn't just any miracle. This was a man who had been dead for 4 days, his body already decaying. People had seen death before. They knew its finality. But now here he was, alive and breathing again. The whispers grew louder, turning into shouts of amazement and awe. Some fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the power of what they had just witnessed. This was no ordinary healing. This was a resurrection. Imagine being in that crowd. What would you have thought? How would you have felt? Would you have been overjoyed, watching Lazarus embrace his sisters, tears of joy streaming down their faces? Or would you have been stunned, unable to process the enormity of what had just happened? The truth is, this moment was meant to shake everyone to their core. It was meant to make them confront a reality that was bigger than anything they had known before. Jesus has power even over death itself. For Mary and Martha, the joy must have been overwhelming. Only moments ago, they were mourning the loss of their brother, resigned to the fact that death had taken him for good. Now, they were witnessing the impossible. Lazarus, whom they had buried, was standing before them alive. Can you picture the moment Martha runs to her brother, grabbing him, touching him to see if it's real? And Mary, perhaps still on her knees, in awe and disbelief, slowly rising to embrace him? Their grief had turned into the purest joy. What was lost had been restored, and in a way that was beyond their wildest hopes. But this miracle wasn't just for them. Jesus knew that Lazarus would rise again, and his purpose stretched far beyond one family's reunion. This was about something much bigger, something eternal. Jesus had said to Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life." Now, he had proven it in the most dramatic way possible. He had shown everyone there that he wasn't just a healer or a prophet. He was the one who holds the keys to life and death. And what about Lazarus? Can you imagine being Lazarus in that moment? Waking up in darkness, feeling the grave clothes tightly wrapped around your body, and then hearing the voice of Jesus call you back to life. What would have gone through his mind as he stumbled out of the tomb, his eyes adjusting to the light, seeing the faces of the people who had mourned him just days before? He must have been filled with a mixture of confusion, joy, and awe. He had experienced death, and yet now he was alive again. As the crowd gathered closer, still buzzing with excitement, Lazarus must have looked at Jesus with a deep sense of gratitude. He owed everything to him, his very life. Lazarus' story was no longer just about him. It was a living testimony to the power of Jesus. Every time someone looked at him, they would remember what Jesus had done. Lazarus had become a walking miracle, and his life would never be the same again. But let's not forget the reactions of the others. While many in the crowd were amazed, falling to their knees in worship, there were others whose hearts were hardened. Not everyone was ready to accept what they had seen. Some could not reconcile what had just happened with their preconceived notions of Jesus. They had seen his miracles before, but this was different. Raising someone from the dead after 4 days? This was a direct challenge to their understanding of life, death, and who Jesus truly was. Some of those in the crowd left immediately, not to celebrate the miracle, but to report it to the Pharisees. They had already been growing uncomfortable with Jesus' influence. His teachings were drawing larger crowds, and the miracles he performed were becoming harder to explain away. But this was something they couldn't ignore. A man raised from the dead after 4 days? This could stir up even more people to believe in him, and that was a threat to their authority. What was intended to inspire faith and bring people closer to God instead stirred up fear and resentment in some hearts. Isn't that often the case? Even when God moves in powerful, undeniable ways, not everyone responds with faith. Sometimes, the very same miracle that causes one person to believe causes another to turn away, clinging to their own control, their own understanding, their own comfort. The news of Lazarus' resurrection reached the Pharisees quickly. They were troubled, to say the least. This wasn't just another healing or exorcism that they could dismiss. This was a direct challenge to their authority and the stability of their religious order. The council was convened, and there was a sense of urgency in the air. They asked themselves, "What are we accomplishing? Here is this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation." Their fear wasn't just about theology, it was about control. If more people started following Jesus, they would lose their influence. Worse, if the crowds grew too large, the Roman authorities might intervene, fearing an uprising. The Pharisees and chief priests felt trapped between their own desire for power and the undeniable truth of what Jesus was doing. Caiaphas, the high priest that year, spoke up. He said something that, in a twist of irony, would turn out to be more prophetic than he realized. "You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish." In his mind, Caiaphas was arguing that they should get rid of Jesus to preserve the status quo. But in a much deeper, divine sense, his words pointed to the ultimate purpose of Jesus' mission. His death would indeed save not just a nation, but the whole world. And so, from that day on, they plotted to kill him. This moment, the raising of Lazarus, was the final turning point. The religious leaders could no longer tolerate Jesus. His influence had grown too strong. And now, with Lazarus walking proof of his power over death, their plans to stop him solidified. The very act that displayed the glory of God to the people was the same act that set in motion the path to the cross. Jesus knew this. He knew that by raising Lazarus, he was sealing his own fate. Yet he did it anyway. Why? Because this miracle wasn't just about Lazarus. It was about foreshadowing the greatest miracle of all, his own death and resurrection. Jesus would soon face death himself. But unlike Lazarus, he wouldn't need anyone to call him out of the tomb. He would rise by his own power, defeating death once and for all, not just for one man, but for all who would believe. And here's the deeper truth we need to grasp. Lazarus' resurrection wasn't just a random event in history. It was a sign pointing to the greater reality of who Jesus is. When he said, "I am the resurrection and the life," he meant it literally. Lazarus' return from the dead was a glimpse, a foretaste, of the eternal life that Jesus offers to everyone who believes in him. This miracle challenges us to reflect on our own lives. Where are the places in us that feel dead? Where are the situations that seem hopeless? Just as Jesus called Lazarus out of the tomb, he calls us to step out of our own graves, the places where fear, doubt, and sin have kept us bound. And he calls us not just to life, but to freedom. Just as he commanded Lazarus' grave clothes to be removed, he commands the things that bind us to be stripped away. Lazarus' story reminds us that no situation is beyond hope. Even when it seems like everything is lost, when the stone has been rolled over the tomb and decay has set in, Jesus can still call life back into existence. But it requires something from us, too. We have to believe, even when the situation seems hopeless. We have to trust that he is the resurrection and the life, not just in the future, but right now, in the middle of our pain, our loss, and our confusion. This miracle also teaches us something about timing. Jesus didn't rush to heal Lazarus. He waited. And in that waiting there was purpose. God's timing is not always ours, but it is always perfect. Sometimes, like Mary and Martha, we wonder why God delays. We wonder why our prayers aren't answered immediately. But Jesus shows us that even in the waiting, he is working for something greater. He is working for our belief, for our faith to be strengthened, for his glory to be revealed in ways we couldn't have imagined.